Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do, Ted, is just to thank our viewers and listeners, anyone watching or listening around the world, anywhere around the world. Thank you so much, first of all, for sharing your presence with us. And today, Ted and myself are creating this interview with the intention of helping you, the viewers and listeners, to live a more present life and to understand that there might be a different way of experiencing your day to day life and existence than the way you're experiencing it now, hopefully with less stress, more joy, and some other aspects as well. So, with that being said, I will also say that it's Liam Hartery back with you today, episode 461, which never fails to amaze me. And I'm very, very blessed and honored to welcome Ted Meissner. Hopefully, I'm saying that the right way, from Massachusetts, USA, and obviously connecting from Cyprus here. Today, we will be talking about Ted's incredible work within the mindfulness field, which he has been conducting since the early 90s, I believe. And he has some incredible accolades to his name. So many, I've actually got a list of them here, including his own podcast. So today I'm interviewing the interviewer, guys. We have the Present Moment Mindfulness Practice and Mindfulness Voyage as well. Awesome podcast if you can check them out and subscribe. Please subscribe to Simply Inspired as well, just so I don't forget to say that. But Ted has presented about mindfulness to various groups, including Apple, United Health, Optum, University of Massachusetts Medical School, the National Black Nurses Association, and many others, has been published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, Mindful, and the International Journal of the Whole Person Care, and is a peer reviewer of articles for the Science Journal of Mindfulness, among many others. He has a list of accolades as long as my arm. I won't read them all here. The point, guys, is that Ted is helping people and contributing to humanity itself, but to the individual lives of many people through sharing a more present perspective. I think that's the way to sum that up, because when we that's enough of me talking about me in third person, but when we actually get talking now, I think that you'll have your own ways of defining what you do, but I also hope you appreciate at the same time the positive impact that I can see you having on so many people around the world. So that's the one thing I'll say. And thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your morning to do this. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Very glad to be here, Liam. It's an honor to be with you on your podcast. Congratulations on making it into the 400s, and eager to hear back from you again when you're past the 500s. It's really quite an amazing thing to look back on the amount of work that you've been doing in sharing the lives of others with people in the world. And as I said before we started recording, just making a difference here and there where you can is really what this work is about. So thank you for all of that.
Very welcome. Very, very welcome. And yes, 400, I mean, it's evolved a lot. 461 plus, I think it's a few more before that. It's evolved a lot as my journey has evolved. But I'm curious, Ted, do you know the number that you're on at the moment? Have you ever kept track of it, or is it just past, so far past counting now?
No, it's a good question. I could look it up. I started with podcasting with the secular Buddhist a long time, 15 some years ago, 16 years now, I think. As in May, it will be 16 years. And that was the longest running. I shifted into present moment mindfulness. Present moment mindfulness practice and science is the full title of that one at some point. So I sunset the secular Buddhist, although that's still out there. And then recently wanted to do essentially the same kind of work around contemplative practices, but to be able to see the people that I was speaking with. So went to YouTube with Mindfulness Voyage, and that's where I'm concentrating. So at this point, it is well over 500. I could add it all up. I think we're 517, something along those lines, something like that.
Sure. Well, that's amazing. You see, spreading the wisdom and spreading the practices. As you know, it's not really the number that counts. It's enjoying each moment with your guests and obviously life in general. But at the same time, I was kind of curious. So, okay, in terms of starting things off properly here, your beginnings in mindfulness. I mean, I'm sure this is something that you speak about often, people would like to know about on a regular basis, I'm sure. But just to briefly contextualize why you do the work that you do as well, because you have such a passion, such a drive, and you've been doing this consistently for such a long time, which I also think is amazing. I mean that is a compliment, a consistent passion to learn and grow and deepen your practices, your understanding. So where did that begin for you, please, Ted? Let's begin there.
Yeah. Well, as it has for many people, one of the challenges that I noticed in my life was, and I see this more and more, difficulty concentrating in an attention economy, which is very different than it was in the early 90s when I started. Now there's just an overwhelming volume of constant distractions and different kinds of things vying for your attention. But we didn't have that quite to that volume back then. It was a dull roar, but I was still having difficulty with just focusing. And a friend had said that they'd heard meditation was helpful for that. So I thought I'd give it a try. And I went to Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. And that's where I first got my start with a 10-minute drop in meditation that they held on, I think it was Sundays at that point. And that was the most difficult 10 minutes of my life, and remains to this day the most difficult 10 minutes of my life, because I had no idea how very active my mind was, how much chatter was going on. And this is the first time I'd taken a look at it. Now, this was very helpful in one way, in that it told me, here's why you can't concentrate on anything, because your mind is going in so many different directions, you don't even know it. But now you're aware of it. It also gave me the opportunity to do something about it. And this is the thing with contemplative practice, is it's about turning towards what's here rather than just retreating from it and turning away from it. Avoidance and suppression tends not to be a very good long-term way of dealing with difficulties in our lives. We do need to turn towards them and work with what's there. Sometimes it's working with our own reactivity to difficult circumstances. And much of the time, it's also clearly seeing those conditions that are causing us to be reactive, stressed, depressed, anxious, whatever it happens to be. So I started, and I'm still on a very long, a lifetime journey of taking a look, seeing what's here, and dealing with it in various ways. And of course, we're never bored in mindfulness, because there is so much to unpack in each unique moment, even if it seems like it's the same thing again. I'm going to be doing a TikTok later on today about our craving for novelty and how mindfulness can help shift us back to really experiencing the same old humdrum stuff with fresh eyes, fresh hearts, fresh minds, and how that can really enrich in our lives. So that's how it started.
Wow, what a beautiful description, and something that I feel so many people will relate to, Ted, which is really why I've actually started there, by the way, even though it seems obvious in a way. People look at the work you're doing now, but taking that back to the beginning, and to some extent, humble beginnings, where you struggled and where it wasn't easy for you then, I think is very inspiring to people. And obviously, I'd like to further that a little bit, because not only was that the most difficult 10 minutes of your life, but you thought, okay, let's do this again. As you said, there's a lot more to unpack, but you kept going down that path. And in those early days, you obviously will have began to experience changes in your day-to-day life. And again, just to touch on this briefly for beginners in mindfulness, especially, because I'm very careful to ask some things here for people who know a lot about this stuff and some people who are basically hearing this for the first time. I'd like to get a little bit deeper into some of the changes you began to experience just in your relationships, friendships, working life, and some of those shifts, particularly in that early phase. Now, I'm not sure what expanse of time you class as the early days, but basically in the beginning for you. Let's touch on that a little bit, please.
Well, it's interesting, and this is a great point you're bringing up, Liam, is that everyone's experience is different
Mm,
because everyone has a unique trajectory and background in their life. So
mhm,
for me, I was learning that my starting point was in a very, very challenged spot,
mm,
as many people do. And for some, it's much, much simpler a practice, and they take to it like a duck to water, as we say out here. And I didn't. It was very much a challenge. It was and remains a discipline,
mhm,
ensuring that I'm actually doing the exercise. If you think of mindfulness practices and contemplative practices in general as exercise, you do need to do those to see the benefits of them. So early on, I didn't see a lot other than I was really interested in learning more about how to be a better person. Because another part that came with this, and I will say it was one of the biggest changes, was a little bit more insight about ways in which I needed to change, that I was not the person that I thought I was, maybe not as kind, and maybe not the kind of person I would want to spend time with. And seeing that a little bit more clearly, again, that practice of turning towards was one of the biggest changes. And as we often say in mindfulness, it's simple. It seems like it's an easy thing, but it's not easy. It's simple, but not easy. And that doesn't mean it's beyond you. I'm one of the people who does strongly believe, because I've seen it happen in my students, that mindfulness is something anyone can do. It will look different from one person to the next. It may be just a few moments of closing your eyes and listening and being present with whatever the soundscape has to offer, even if it's silence. It may be for others sitting down and doing an anchor, like focusing on the breath for hours at a time. It's different for everyone. That's not a judgment. It's simply where we are and appropriately responding to what's showing up for us.
wonderful, wonderful description, Ted. And I love that because the reason I started with yourself personally, even though we will broaden this out shortly into your work and other things, is really what you said there, the things you discovered about yourself, the things you liked, the things you didn't like, the things you needed to change. Because I am a big believer in that concept, being the change that you'd like to see in the world. It's all very well to intellectualize things and look at what other people should be doing and all of these things, but starting with ourselves, obviously, as you know very well, is such an important topic that people may not realize. Now, the other thing about that is it's all very well that this was changing your life, but at some point you must have had the decision, the initial spark, if you like, to bring this to others. And again, something I admire greatly because that's what you've spent your life doing since then. But some people would have kept in their own practice, but they wouldn't have really thought of, well, I'd like to share this. And again, no wrongs or rights here. I just very much do admire the work you do. Obviously, hence we're talking here. And I'd like to just touch on that initial inspiration of where you originally felt, okay, people need to know about this. People need to feel this in their own way as well as me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of different aspects to this. One is the idea that contemplative practice is not just about our inner workings. It is also very much a social thing. That while in fact, again, I just posted about this yesterday. I am enriched by solitude. That's a different thing than isolation. So my practice, my preferred, what works best for me, what I see the most beneficial outcomes for, and the most challenging kind of work is to do the practice on my own. But my first decades of practice, and then for many years thereafter, and still is practicing with others. And there is that interconnected joy of growing and learning and being with others in the practice and seeing the changes not just in ourselves but in others. So it's very much a social thing. And what the first time that I was shifted into the role of speaking about this, sharing it with others, was I think there was a retreat going on at Zen Center, and many of the teachers were not available. And I was asked if I could give a talk for the Saturday community gathering. And so I did. I gave a talk. It was a little different than a standard Zen talk, because at this point I was also deeply exploring Theravada Buddhist practices, which is another way of looking at contemplative practice traditions, and did talk on right speech, which is a particular aspect of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism. And it was an interesting experience because people were very interested in hearing this kind of way of looking at it that was not very common at the time, in that place. And that sparked an interest in me. What would it be like to share this a little more broadly? And rather than only relying on the others who had decided to, in this tradition, become priests or monks, which I was not going to do, was there a way for me to be able to share in this way? And so I started a journey and ran across mindfulness-based stress reduction, and eventually became a teacher of that, as well as some other practices as well. That's a particular course that we can talk about later if you like.
Absolutely. That is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And that's another thing I'm really glad we've mentioned, Ted, because in many ways you are a pioneer as well. I mean, that's another thing with this, in the sense there is a transformative aspect to you, as you said there, developing your own spin on some of these things. I mean that as a compliment, is not the best term for it, but you know what I mean. There is that development with regards to the practices, and I enjoy that very much. Okay, so teaching now in terms of some of the broader topics. An interesting question for you here, I think, would be how you define mindfulness personally, because one of the things that you know that we're going to come up, but obviously you've explored different lineages, different forms of practice. You have explored the secular side, the more religious side, you know, all of these different things. And because you've been around this for so long, people get caught up in trying to put these practices in boxes and different things like that. And I'd like to take it back almost to a simpler definition of how you would actually define the practices that we will be talking about from a bigger picture point of view very shortly.
Yeah, that is one of the most interesting questions that I get asked about. What do we really mean by mindfulness? And I want to start this by saying that there are different ways of looking at mindfulness. That as we define mindfulness in a traditional setting, it has very particular meanings with it. As we define mindfulness in a secular context with a program like MBSR or MBCT or others, it can be a little different than that. And then there's our own personal way of looking at it. What does it mean to me? So I want to give a few different answers to that, if I may, and understanding that, again, it doesn't mean one is more right than the other. It means that they are looking at it from different points of view. There is a traditional view of mindfulness, and that involves different aspects to what it looks like, awareness of body and mind and phenomenon, that kind of stuff. There is a more research oriented secular approach, which includes mindfulness as having primarily three different aspects to it: intention, attention, and awareness. This is the IAA model. Those who are familiar with research around mindfulness may be familiar with that. That comes from Shauna Shapiro and colleagues some years ago, as seeing these different aspects to mindfulness. But again, there are lots of different ways of looking at it, even in research. I was honored to be a co-author on a paper led by Nicholas Van Dam on Mind the Hype, in which we shared a little bit about mindfulness and how there is not just one definition, even in research around it. And then the personal view, I want to give credit to Gi Hong for asking this question on Action for Happiness podcast. I was a guest on that some years ago, and he asked this question, and I hadn't really grappled with it before. And what arose for me in that moment is that mindfulness is, for me, showing up with care. And I mean that in a few different ways. There are some layers to that. Showing up, showing, it's an action verb. There is something that you do here. It's not just about your presence and being. There is activity to this, there is intentionality around it. And with care, showing up with care, I mean the word care in two different ways. Care in terms of the delicacy that might be used in building a house of cards and making sure everything is just so, that gentleness, but also care as heartfulness, of care, compassion, friendliness. It's all encompassed for me in that very broad view of showing up with care. So it's a great question because there are lots of different ways to look at it, and different people who get involved with mindfulness and contemplative practice in general will find that it has its own meaning to them.
Absolutely. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and it's very good to have the overview of that. As you say, for different people, it does manifest differently, it does show up differently, but at the same time, I do get where you're coming from. Now, there's certain areas that you focus on, and one of my intentions, seeing as that was something we mentioned there with this podcast, is to kind of enlighten people in the sense of different ways they can experience their day-to-day life. And really, I'm not trying to say to people any more than that. I'm not trying to say, look, you need to do things this way, you need to do things this way. I'm just saying, please stop and consider for just a moment that the way you've always been doing it, whatever it is for you, may not be the best way for you. And then beyond there, which path they choose to go down is up to them. And the reason um, I say that before we go any further is just to say that I'm not saying to people you have to do it this way. I'm just saying please consider that there are other ways to live. And that leads me to an important topic that I've seen your work around a lot. I've seen the connection there, burnout aspect and stress. And it's something that I've been fascinated by the observation that people seem to feel, very broadly speaking, in the world today, that in order to be productive, they need to be tense and concentrated and serious and some of these things. Broadly speaking, that's a little bit of a generalization, but I've seen the contrast of people doing a lot of really good work and accomplishing a lot of really good things without being stressed out. And I remember first experiencing that, thinking, wow, that's possible. Is it? Okay, I wish somebody had told me that before now. But that topic is quite broad. But I would just like to touch on the fact that burnout is a very large ailment. It's almost like we've eliminated so many of these diseases, these physical diseases that used to plague people back, 50, 80 years ago, and we've eliminated so much with infant mortality and childbirth and increased the lifespan and all of these things. But then there's new diseases, in a sense, arising from my perspective today because of the information age that we live in, I'm guessing. So stress, anxiety, its connection to fatigue and burnout, and what people can do about it. It's a very broad topic, but I would like to get a few key insights on that from you, please, Ted. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the pivotal questions of our age, especially as people are experiencing unprecedented levels of burnout.
Mm,
So let's first approach with a little bit of shared understanding about what burnout is,
mm,
because one of the things I've found out in teaching courses about burnout prevention and remediation, is that burnout is not just one thing. It's not just I'm tired. There are different aspects to it. And interestingly enough, burnout research has been going on for about the same amount of time, about 40 years, as mindfulness scientific research has gone on. And there are some strong consistencies around it. First is there are at least, depending on how one looks at it, three different aspects to burnout. There is the exhaustion part that most of us are familiar with and think of as burnout. We're just tired. There's so much going on and not enough time to do it. But there's also two other primary domains to this. One is cynicism, which is I might not be exhausted, but boy, I just don't like my work anymore. I'm no longer enthusiastic about what I do. That's another aspect of burnout. And then another one is efficacy. I'm no longer able to be successful at my job. I may love it and there may be the right amount of work, but it's just not coming together. And again, that may not be on the shoulders of the person who's experiencing burnout. And that's one of the most important messages here. It may be for that efficacy thing. There's not enough training on new systems that are being implemented. There's constant change, and it is very difficult to keep up with that constant change. Things are technically not working at all, and that impacts your ability. Maybe if you're in the caring professions or healthcare, you can't be successful in helping others, and that can take a personal toll. So one of the things that when I was building my burnout course, I looked at many wellnesses program. I worked in the corporate sector for most of my career, and I noticed something that I push against regularly. Particularly on LinkedIn, I'm posting about this kind of thing every day. Is that there's a tendency to have the person who is experiencing sadness or anxiousness or whatever it happens to be as the problem is with them. And it's not. They are appropriately responding to conditions that they're in. So each of us, if we're running into some sadness, some tension, some irritation, some joy, some lightness, some calm, so much of that is based on the conditions that are there that influence the conditions inside of us. So with burnout, what I saw was a lot of programs that would be distractions. Take a few minutes, listen to this soothing music. Let's do a guided meditation that is going to make you feel okay for the duration you've got it. But as soon as it's done, you're right back to being stressed again. This is one of the first parts in my course. I talk about it as vacation syndrome. For those who are watching or listening, you may have had the experience where you go away on vacation and you feel great, rested, energized. Everything is wonderful. You come back, and 5 minutes later, you're every bit as wound up as you were before you left. And of course, the reasons for that are the conditions that got you all tense in the first place are still there. And this is where mindfulness can come in. Remember at the beginning of my own story about this, I could see that I needed to change and the things around me that were causing these difficulties. That's what's been included in this. Clearly seeing not only how to take care of myself and regulate and deal with the difficult internal workings, but not stopping there. Also looking at the conditions that are causing that tension, that depression, that anxiety, that stress, whatever it happens to be. Without that, it's just distraction and avoidance. And that's not a good long-term strategy.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually. It fills in some blanks there that I've also noticed, having personally experienced a lot of that as well as through our observation of others. So, very valuable topic, Ted, for the age that we live in, and certainly something I know you could go a lot deeper into. But that's a very nice overview there, and I am mindful of your time as well. So, the last couple of things so that you have enough space there as well. You mentioned earlier about the endless distractions that we experience in the modern age, especially due to these devices. But in general, that there's a lot of them. There seems to be a lot of complexity in life. There's obviously a lot of improvement in quality of life, but a lot of complexity that's come with it. And one of my personal takeaways from the Zen tradition, when you were talking about that earlier, simplicity and living a simpler life, it's a very broad topic, but I'd like to get your advice on basically how people can do that because going right back to the beginning, we touched on that. Then later, you also touched on a separate but possibly related aspect being the novelty and the need for novelty as well, which I do feel that a lot of this technology actually drives people into. But anyway, that whole concept of bringing things back to how people can be more mindful in the sense of how they can do one job at a time without various other things coming at them, coming into their space. I just think that's immensely valuable because from that foundation, people can build various other things. But from the distracted mind, as you said earlier, it's very difficult. So I'd like to just go a little bit deeper into that topic, please, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really good one to take a look at closely because it's the how do I start? And understanding that for many people, they may try mindfulness and decide, yeah, I don't like this so much. And that's okay. That's fine. It is like physical exercise. Not everyone is going to want to run a marathon. For some folks, it's going to be, I'll walk around the track or do some fast walking and that's enough, or not at all. You need to make your individual choices. And choice is a big part of this. One of the contributing factors to burnout is not having choice and feeling like we don't have choice. That is also a part of trauma sensitive mindfulness, the way that we deal with the strong dysregulation that may show up when there's a history of trauma, and not even necessarily a history of trauma, but just difficulties with our contemplative practice, making sure we support this idea of agency and choice. You're not stuck with whatever it is you're going through. You're not stuck. You can change internally how you are reacting to things, shifting more closely to choosing your response. But that's very hard to do if you don't even know how you're doing. So I recommend people first learn how to just check in and notice, how are you doing? How are you feeling right now? It's really difficult to get out of a forest if you're dropped in the middle of it at night and you have no idea even where you are to know how to get to somewhere else. So my recommendation is not to start with a week long or a 10-day heavyweight retreat that's all in silence. That's learning how to swim in the deep end of a shark infested ocean. It's maybe not the best way to start. First, learn how to notice how you're doing so that you can make appropriate adjustments in your practice. It may be that some days longer meditation is something that you're up for, or you don't feel like you're up for, but really you can. You can challenge yourself that way. So that starting practice of checking in is taking a brief tour of your five senses and also your state of mind or state of heart. How are you feeling right now? And that's something to always have accessible and nearby. Because if you understand that, I'm doing this one particular meditation practice and I'm noticing that, wow, I'm getting really overwhelmed. I'm not challenged by this, I'm overwhelmed by it. Maybe it's time to make a change and see how that goes. That's often what happens with what are known as adverse effects in meditation and in other disciplines as well, where there isn't any information or practice on how to make adjustments. So people may find themselves getting overwhelmed when it could have been avoided. And that's why it's so important to have a well-trained teacher who does continuing education themselves and continues to learn about new findings in practices. So one of the things that some people watching or listening may have heard of is the window of tolerance. And that's often pictured as a window, and you have your comfort zone in the middle, and then there's hyper arousal and hypo arousal, fight or flight or freeze. Now, I've changed that a little bit. I do a circle of tolerance where in the middle, that's your comfort zone. That's where everything is chill and okay. And then there's a green band around that, a circle around that. That's where we're challenged. And that's where growing comes from. Stress is not all bad. I mean, we stress our bodies when we exercise so that they become more flexible, stronger, limber, can endure more, whatever it happens to be. That is actually a beneficial kind of stress. Meditation is, again, like exercise. So staying within that challenged zone, doing practices you might not like so much. There are some meditations I really don't like, but I know they're very helpful for me, so I do them anyway. And I'm challenged by them every time, and I grow every time. That's the optimal place to be. But also, this checking in practice helps us to notice when we're starting to go to that outer circle of overwhelmed, fight, flight, or freeze, hyperarousal, hypoarousal. And those can shift. The reason I changed it to a circle is that they're not separate. You can shift between them as well. So the most important thing is to start by just noticing how you're doing, because that is going to help you make adjustments in whatever practice you end up pursuing over time. And it's not just one thing. There's lots of different kinds of practices.
Absolutely wonderful. I've certainly learned a lot there, Ted, from that one. So it's a really good breakdown. Now I know today that we have only scratched the surface with a lot of things, but at the same time, going back to what I said earlier, where giving people that awareness of there's just a different way of doing things, or even for example with this topic that we were just talking about now, even if people have been doing some practices, then kind of reframing a few things or thinking of a different perspective on that also really helps as well, because even what you said there about the seeing how you're doing, self-awareness, this kind of thing, it's funny that can get lost along the way too. I mean, I've seen some people um, practice in a very rigid way, and I'm sometimes looking at that and thinking, and I've also been guilty of this, where sometimes I'm working against myself rather than with
Yeah.
myself, and that aspect of the practice as well is very important. I'm really glad you mentioned that because a lot of people overlook that. Well, the work that you're doing in the world is absolutely wonderful, and Ted, I will say that if you'd ever like to do another episode like this as well, it doesn't have to be just one. We can always do something on a specific topic as well and go more in depth. I don't always say that, but lately there have been a few people where I've actually had another catch up with them and we've gone deeper into a particular topic of like burnout or like the novelty thing or like something else. So we can always do that. But for today, it's wonderful because it's a really, really nice overview. And as I said at the beginning, people can take away a few things that they can practically apply, whether they are just beginning to do so, whether they're a little bit down the path, and just increasing their awareness and presence. And as I said to you before we were recording, we if we touch just a handful of people with this, then we've done some good work. So I'm very grateful for you taking time out of your morning. I will say to our viewers and listeners as well, please check out the work that Ted is doing online. Look him up, join in. He's not hard to find. So there's a lot of great articles out there you can read. There's obviously the social media you can connect with as well. So there's all sorts of different things. So I will say that to our viewers and listeners because if you'd like to find out more about particular topics or about the work that Ted is doing in general, please do look him up, guys, as well. So I hope that a few more people have heard about yourself, Ted, and your work as well. But I know you have another call to get to, so I just want to say a big, big thank you for taking the time to talk with me, and it's been a joy just sharing this present moment with you. Really, I mean, it's as simple as that. It's been wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Liam, for all the work you're doing in sharing voices with the world that may connect with people who are in need of hearing those voices. And I would very much love to come back and talk about anything a little bit more in depth, because as I mentioned before, we'll never be bored with mindfulness. There's always, always something to take a look at. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day, and my best wishes to you. I hope everything goes really, really well. And although we've been having a largely secular talk, I will bow actually as one practice I do keep, because I do feel in this case that's certainly very warranted. So thank you for sharing everything you've shared once again, and have a great day, my friend. Thank you.
You too, Liam. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the Simply Inspired YouTube channel, and there'll be more videos coming soon.